The story opens inside Shawshank Prison during an early morning roll call. Inmates file out of their cells one by one while guards count them off. Everything looks routine until a guard realizes that prisoner number 245, Andy Dufresne, hasn't appeared. Furious, the guard marches toward Andy's cell and shouts that Andy had better be sick or dead in there, because he isn't joking around. But when the guard reaches the door, he stops cold. The cell is completely empty. Alarms immediately begin screaming across the entire building. Guards pour through the hallways while confused inmates jolt awake. Warden Norton charges into the cell demanding explanations from everyone, and especially from Red, since Andy and Red were inseparable. But Red is just as baffled as everyone else. In a fit of rage, Norton snatches a small rock from Andy's desk and hurls it at the wall. Instead of bouncing back, it punches straight through the poster hanging next to Andy's bed. The room goes dead quiet. Guards peel the poster down and find a massive tunnel carved into the wall behind it, a tunnel leading directly outside the prison. That's the moment Shawshank understands what has happened. An inmate has broken out of one of the most secure prisons in the country. Officers scour the grounds surrounding the facility and eventually turn up an old prison uniform, a tiny rock hammer, and a shattered sewage pipe on the outside. Nobody can figure out how a man chipped through solid concrete with something that small. And that question sends the movie all the way back to the beginning. Years earlier, a banker named Andy Dufresne sits alone inside a parked car on a rainy night with a gun in his hand. That same evening, he found out his wife was sleeping with another man. Drunk and devastated, Andy drove out to their house and sat there weighing whether to kill them both. But before he acted, somebody else murdered them first. The problem is that every piece of evidence points straight at Andy. At trial, the prosecutor dismantles his account detail by detail. Witnesses spotted him near the house. His gun matched the bullets found at the scene. He'd had a heated argument with his wife. No matter how many times Andy insists he never went through with it, nobody believes him. The judge hands down 2 consecutive life sentences for double murder. Shortly after, Andy is transported to Shawshank alongside a group of new inmates. As those massive gray gates swing open, the newcomers take in the walls looming around them, while armed guards bark orders from every direction, patrolling the yard like soldiers protecting a fortress. Inside the yard, the veteran inmates gather to watch the new arrivals like it's the day's entertainment. They start placing bets on which newcomer will break down crying first after lights out. Most of the money lands on a heavy-set, visibly panicked prisoner who already looks like he's about to fall apart. Red, though, spots Andy standing quietly in line, not speaking to anyone, and something about that catches his eye. Red bets on Andy instead. The new prisoners are stripped, searched, and locked into their cells. Before lights out, the warden introduces himself, speaking in a measured, almost religious tone while laying out Shawshank's rules. Then Captain Hadley, the most feared guard in the entire prison, steps up and makes it brutally clear what happens to anyone who steps out of line. That first night turns into something out of a nightmare. The older inmates shout and taunt the newcomers across the cell block until the heavy-set prisoner completely falls apart, sobbing and begging to go home. His cries bounce off every wall until Hadley storms in and orders him to stop. When the terrified man can't get himself under control, Hadley snaps. The guards haul him out and beat him savagely, while the rest of the prison listens in silence. The screaming goes on for several minutes and then just stops. Hadley walks back through the cell block and makes it perfectly clear that if anyone makes so much as a sound for the rest of the night, they'll wind up in the infirmary just like the poor wretch who's already down there. The next morning, the inmates find out the man didn't survive the beating. Nobody can even remember what his name was, but Red notices something strange. Through everything that happened the night before, Andy never uttered a single sound. He sat in his cell like his mind was somewhere far away. Over the following weeks, Andy barely interacts with anyone. Because he's calm and well-educated, most prisoners take his quietness for weakness. But Red grows increasingly curious. Eventually, Andy comes to him directly, having heard that Red is the man who can bring things inside the prison that aren't supposed to be there. Andy wants a small rock hammer. Red's first instinct is suspicion, since tools inside a prison generally mean trouble. But the moment he actually sees how tiny the hammer is, he laughs out loud. You'd need centuries to dig through prison walls with something that small. He agrees to get it. Before long, the hammer arrives hidden inside a package, and it goes straight into Andy's possession. Around the same time, life inside Shawshank gets significantly worse for him. A violent prison gang known as the Sisters starts coming after Andy constantly. Their leader Boggs becomes fixated on him. Whenever they catch him alone, they beat and assault him. Andy throws himself back at them every single time, but the attacks drag on for years, leaving him battered and hurt repeatedly. Even so, Andy never completely cracks. One afternoon, Andy and several other inmates, including Red, get picked for rooftop work repairing a section of the prison. While they labor in the heat, Captain Hadley vents to a fellow guard about an inheritance he received after his brother died. He's furious because taxes are going to swallow most of the money. Andy overhears him. Finance is the one domain where Andy still holds real power, and he decides to use it. He walks carefully over to Hadley and asks him one very dangerous question, whether Hadley trusts his wife. Hadley grabs Andy immediately and shoves him toward the edge of the roof, convinced he's being made fun of. The other inmates go rigid with fear because everyone knows Hadley has hurt inmates without thinking twice about it. But Andy speaks quickly and calmly, explaining that the inheritance can legally be transferred to Hadley's wife as a tax-free gift, letting him keep almost every dollar of it. Hadley gradually realizes Andy is telling him the truth. In exchange for handling all the paperwork, Andy asks for exactly one thing: cold beers for every man working up on that roof. A few days later, the prisoners sit together in the sun drinking beer like they haven't got a care in the world, feeling something close to free for the first time in years. Andy doesn't touch a drop himself. He just sits back, watches the others, and smiles quietly. From that day on, the men around him start to respect him. Even Red finally accepts that Andy Dufresne is unlike anyone else inside Shawshank. After the rooftop incident, Andy's standing in the prison rises steadily. Guards from across the facility start seeking him out for help with tax forms, financial paperwork, and investment questions because they quickly figure out he knows more than most lawyers on the outside. Even Hadley, the same man who nearly threw him off a roof, begins treating him with something resembling consideration. Red notices the change in Andy too. He talks more, cracks the occasional joke, actually spends time with other prisoners at meals. For a moment, it almost looks like Andy is making peace with the life he's been handed. But the sisters keep coming for him. One night, Boggs and his crew corner Andy again in the prison laundry room. Andy fights harder than ever, refusing to give in, and so the gang beats him half to death. He spends more than a month in the infirmary, barely able to move. This time, though, the outcome is different. When Boggs gets out of solitary after the attack, Hadley hears what happened. Because Andy handles financial matters for the guards now, Hadley considers him worth protecting. He and several other guards drag Boggs away and beat him so badly he ends up permanently crippled. After that, the sisters leave Andy alone for good. Once he's recovered, Andy returns to his cell to find a large Rita Hayworth poster waiting for him, a gift from Red. Andy thanks him without making a big deal of it and hangs the poster carefully on the wall beside his bed. Shortly after, Warden Norton comes to Andy's cell for inspection. Norton carries himself with a quiet, religious calm, always pulling Bible verses into conversation as though he's a holy man. He sees Andy reading a Bible and nods with approval. Then his gaze drifts over to the Rita Hayworth poster. Technically forbidden, but Norton lets it stay. Before leaving, he hands Andy the Bible and says something that turns out to be important much later. Salvation lies within. Andy's prison assignment also changes soon after. Instead of hard labor, he's moved to work in the prison library alongside an elderly inmate named Brooks, a man who has spent nearly his entire life inside Shawshank. The library is small and barely stocked when Andy gets there, and most prisoners have no reason to visit. Andy starts trying to fix that immediately. Every single week, without fail, he writes letters to the state senate requesting funds, books, and materials to expand the collection. The administration ignores him completely. Andy writes another letter the following week, and the one after that. His reputation across the prison keeps building in the meantime. Guards line up for financial guidance on taxes, savings, investments, and insurance policies. Eventually, Warden Norton begins using Andy for something far darker, secretly laundering money from prison labor contracts that Norton shouldn't have in the first place. Norton sets up a scheme where prisoners work jobs outside the prison for nothing, while he quietly pockets enormous profits. Because the money can't be touched legally, Andy builds a fictional identity called Randall Stevens, complete with fake signatures, identification documents, and financial records so convincing that Randall Stevens looks entirely real on paper, despite not existing anywhere in the world. Years move quickly after that. Then one day, everything inside the library suddenly erupts. Brooks grabs another inmate and presses a knife against his throat. Guards flood in while everyone scrambles, and Brooks starts weeping uncontrollably, saying he doesn't want to go. The truth comes out. After 50 years inside Shawshank, Brooks has been approved for parole. Rather than celebrating, he's completely undone by the news. Prison is the only life he knows anymore. Out there, he has no family, no friends, and no way of understanding how the world works in the present. Red explains it to Andy plainly. Brooks has been institutionalized. After so many decades behind bars, freedom has become more frightening to him than prison ever was. Brooks leaves regardless. For the first time in many decades, he's walking through streets full of cars, crowds, and noise that feel utterly alien to him. He gets a small apartment and a job at a grocery store, but everything about normal life feels crushing and overwhelming. Each night he lies there thinking about Shawshank. The world outside feels lonelier and colder than any prison cell he ever sat in. Eventually, the loneliness becomes unbearable, and Brooks hangs himself in his apartment, carving the words "Brooks was here" into the wooden beam above him before he goes. Back inside Shawshank, the news reaches the prisoners. Andy sits with it quietly for a long time. Around this same period, Andy's persistence with those letters finally produces results. The state senate sends over several boxes of books, records, and a small sum of money designated for the library. Most men would have considered that a victory and moved on. Andy immediately starts writing even more letters asking for additional funding. One afternoon, while sorting through the donated materials, he comes across a classical opera recording. An idea takes shape. While working inside the warden's office, Andy locks the door, places the record on the loudspeaker system that runs throughout the entire prison, and turns it up all the way. Sweeping operatic music rolls down every corridor, into every cell, and across the prison yard. Inmates stop in the middle of whatever they're doing. Guards stand completely still. For a few suspended minutes, the whole prison shifts into something unrecognizable. The walls and the bars seem to fall away, while every man inside listens to something beautiful and pure that belongs to a world beyond those fences. Nobody understands the words being sung, but every single person in Shawshank understands what the music means. The guards eventually break the door down and haul Andy away. As punishment, Norton throws him into solitary confinement for 2 full weeks. When Andy comes out, Red asks whether a few minutes of music was honestly worth all of that. Andy smiles and says calmly that there are things prisons simply cannot reach inside a man. Hope is one of them. Red pushes back. In his view, hope inside Shawshank is nothing but poison, something that drives prisoners out of their minds. After all those years behind bars and all those parole denials, Red has learned that hope only sharpens the pain of disappointment. But Andy's thinking doesn't shift. No matter what Shawshank throws at him, he goes on believing that one day he will walk out of there as a free man. The years keep accumulating, and Andy keeps building. The library becomes the best part of the entire prison. Books pour in constantly, shelves multiply, and men who once spent every day in idle aggression now sit quietly reading or studying. Andy begins running basic education classes for inmates who want to earn their diplomas before they're released. For the first time in a long while, some of those men start thinking they might still have a life waiting for them on the outside. Meanwhile, Norton's wealth grows without limit. Using prison labor that costs him nothing, he wins construction contracts across the state because no legitimate company can undercut workers who come completely free. Norton collects the profits quietly in the background, while Andy keeps all of it hidden and clean through the Randall Stevens accounts, built with fake signatures, fraudulent tax documents, and forged identification so thorough that nothing looks out of place. What Norton doesn't know is that Andy has been keeping copies of every record the entire time. Then in 1965, a new group of inmates arrives at Shawshank. One of them is a young prisoner named Tommy Williams, loud, constantly talking, full of a restless energy that hasn't been worn down yet. He quickly falls in with Red and the others and brings some life back into routines that had grown heavy and gray. Tommy eventually starts spending time with Andy in the library. He never finished school, so Andy offers to help him prepare for his diploma exams. Tommy clowns around at first and doesn't take it seriously, but over time, something shifts. He starts genuinely working at it, because for once in his life, someone is treating him like he's capable of being more than he's been. One night, sitting with Red and Andy, Tommy brings up something that stops the conversation cold. Years back, in a different prison, he shared a cell with a dangerous man who liked to boast. The man bragged about pulling off a double murder during a burglary, describing how he broke into a wealthy banker's home and killed the banker's wife and her lover after they caught him in the act. Then he laughed about how the husband ended up taking the blame for everything. The moment Tommy finishes, Andy goes completely still because every detail of that story mirrors the murder case that buried him in Shawshank. For nearly 20 years, Andy has been locked inside this prison as an innocent man, and now, for the first time, he has something that could actually prove it. The next morning, Andy goes straight to Warden Norton and lays everything out. He urges Norton to reopen the investigation and bring it to the proper authorities. On the surface, Norton appears unmoved, but beneath that calm, he's quietly terrified. If Andy walks out of Shawshank, the entire laundering operation falls apart. Andy knows every detail of Norton's criminal empire, every fake account, every corrupt contract, every dollar stolen. Norton cannot let Andy leave. Still pushing, Andy argues that Tommy can testify and point investigators toward the real killer. Norton tells him flatly that no court would take a criminal's old story seriously after this many years. Andy loses control for the first and only time in the film. He screams at Norton, accusing him directly of keeping an innocent man caged for profit. Norton's expression closes down instantly. Without another word, he orders the guards to drag Andy into solitary confinement. A few days later, Norton has Tommy brought out into the prison yard late at night. He asks the young man in a measured tone whether the story about the real killer is true. Tommy confirms it, genuinely believing the warden wants to help Andy get justice. Then Norton quietly steps to the side and signals a guard positioned above with a rifle. Seconds later, Tommy is shot multiple times and collapses dead in the dirt. The official account claims he was attempting to escape. Everyone inside Shawshank knows exactly what happened. Norton visits Andy in solitary afterward and informs him coolly that Tommy died trying to run. Andy understands immediately. Utterly devastated, Andy tells Norton he's done laundering money for him. Norton reminds Andy of the reality. Inside Shawshank, Norton controls everything. If Andy refuses, the library gets shut down, the education programs disappear, and Andy spends the rest of his sentence rotting in solitary. When Andy finally comes out of solitary a month later, Red can see right away that something has changed. He looks hollowed out, exhausted, quieter than Red has ever seen him. That night, Andy sits next to Red and starts describing a place on the Pacific coast of Mexico called Zihuatanejo, a quiet town on the ocean where the water is warm and nobody asks about your past. He talks about opening a small hotel there and spending his days repairing old fishing boats by the water. Then he looks at Red and tells him he hopes Red will come find him there someday. Red shuts it down immediately. After everything he's lived through, Red doesn't let himself believe in things like that anymore. Hope, to him, is just the fastest route to a more painful fall. Andy just smiles and offers Red the most important line in the whole story. Get busy living, or get busy dying. Before he gets up, Andy gives Red a specific set of instructions. If Red ever makes it out, he should go to a field near Buxton. There, at the base of a large oak tree beside a stone wall, Andy has hidden something that belongs to Red. Red can't quite figure out why Andy sounds so deliberate about it all. Then it gets stranger. Later that same night, another inmate mentions to Red that Andy recently asked him for a long piece of rope. Red's stomach drops. After everything Andy has been through, the wrongful conviction, the years of beatings, Tommy's murder, the weeks alone in solitary, Red is suddenly convinced that his best friend is planning to end his life. That night is the longest of Red's life. Outside, a thunderstorm tears across the sky and drenches Shawshank in rain. And inside his cell, while everyone else waits out the storm, Andy Dufresne quietly begins doing the impossible. The next morning, guards open the cells for roll call and count off names. Andy doesn't appear. At first, it barely registers. Red assumes Andy is still in his bunk after how broken he looked the night before. A guard stomps toward the cell and shouts at Andy to get up. Then he looks inside and goes completely still. Empty. Alarms rip through every hallway within seconds. For the first time in Shawshank's history, an inmate has simply vanished. Norton rushes to the cell while guards tear the entire block apart, searching. Red gets hauled into the room immediately because everyone knows he was Andy's closest friend. Norton demands to know where Andy is. Red has no answers. The warden goes into a fury and begins hurling things around the room, and then one of those objects smashes directly into the poster on Andy's wall. Everyone freezes. Norton walks over and pulls the poster down himself. Behind it is a massive tunnel carved deep into the concrete, a tunnel that nobody knew was there. The guards stare at it in silence. For nearly 20 years, Andy had been chipping through solid stone with the tiny rock hammer Red brought him all those years ago. The escape that seemed impossible is suddenly and undeniably real. The tunnel runs behind the wall until it connects to a sewage pipe running under the prison. Guards scramble to search the perimeter while Norton stands in Andy's empty cell, finally grasping that the quiet, polished banker he'd been exploiting had been planning this for almost the entire duration of his sentence. Then the film shows exactly how he did it. The night before, after leaving the warden's office, Andy carefully sealed Norton's financial records and every piece of incriminating evidence into a waterproof bag. He also swapped out his prison boots for Norton's polished leather dress shoes. Then, as the thunderstorm cracked overhead and drowned out every sound, he pulled the poster aside and crawled into the tunnel he'd spent 2 decades building inch by inch. All those years, every chip of concrete he dug loose was slipped into his pockets and scattered grain by grain across the prison yard during his daily walks. Nobody ever looked twice at him. 20 years of slow, meticulous work, and nobody saw a thing. When he reached the sewage pipe at the end, Andy used a heavy rock to beat through the corroded metal. The storm swallowed every sound the blows made. When the pipe finally broke open, he pushed inside and crawled through nearly half a mile of raw sewage, wastewater, and complete darkness, vomiting along the way but never stopping. After 19 years inside Shawshank, the other side of that pipe meant everything. When he finally tore through the end, he dropped into a river in the open air outside the prison walls. For the first time in almost 2 decades, Andy Dufresne was free. He stood in the downpour, with his arms thrown wide, and his face lifted to the sky while the rain stripped every trace of filth from his body as though it were washing away Shawshank itself. But Andy wasn't finished. The following morning, a man named Randall Stevens walked into several banks and made a series of withdrawals. Because Randall Stevens existed perfectly on paper, complete with signatures, identification, and legal documentation that Andy had built over years, nobody questioned anything. By the end of the day, Andy had pulled over $370,000 out of the warden's hidden accounts. Then he mailed every financial record he'd collected, the money laundering, the fraudulent labor contracts, the corruption, the murders, directly to newspapers and government officials. Back at Shawshank, Norton strolls confidently toward his office safe, certain his evidence is still locked safely away. When he opens it, he finds Andy's Bible sitting inside. He opens the cover. The interior pages have been hollowed out in the shape of the small rock hammer. Andy had hidden there all along, and Andy left one final note for the man who imprisoned him. It reads simply that the warden was right. Salvation lay within. At that exact moment, police cruisers begin arriving at Shawshank in force. The newspapers have already run everything. Captain Hadley is arrested for murder, federal agents move through the prison, and Norton finally understands that the empire he built has been completely dismantled overnight by the one man he spent 20 years underestimating. With prison now waiting for him on the other side of his own gates, Norton locks himself in his office. A gunshot echoes through Shawshank. The corrupt warden is dead. Somewhere far from all of it, Andy arrives in Mexico. Nobody is watching him. Nobody is counting him. Nobody controls a single second of his life. Sometime later, Red receives a postcard with no return address. On the front is a photograph of a beach in Mexico. Red looks at it for a moment and understands everything. Andy made it. His friend escaped Shawshank and found the place he'd been dreaming about through every one of those years. For the first time in a long while, Red smiles like someone who isn't carrying a prison on his back. Inside Shawshank, Andy's escape takes on a life of its own. Every inmate talks about the banker who dug his way through solid concrete walls using a hammer the size of a child's toy. Even the guards can't fully wrap their minds around it. More years pass. Then Red appears before the parole board again after nearly 40 years inside the prison. This time, he doesn't try to play the game. He doesn't deliver a polished speech about rehabilitation designed to tell the board exactly what they want to hear. Instead, he tells them the truth. He says he regrets the crime he committed as a young man, not because saying so might get him out, but because he genuinely means it, because he hates the reckless young man he was and what that young man did to another person's life. The board listens quietly. It's the most honest Red has ever been in that room, and for the first time in 40 years, they approve his release. Red walks out through the gates of Shawshank carrying almost nothing. The gates close behind him and stay closed, but freedom doesn't feel like what he expected. It feels disorienting and enormous and cold. The world has changed too much while he was inside. Cars move differently, buildings are taller, people live in ways he doesn't recognize. He feels exactly what he watched Brooks feel, lost, unmoored, and terrified of open space. He gets assigned a small apartment and starts bagging groceries at a store. Every single time he needs to use the bathroom during his shift, he automatically asks his manager for permission, the way he had to do every day for 40 years. Alone at night, Red thinks about Shawshank. He thinks about Brooks. He thinks about Andy. The loneliness grows heavy enough some nights that he finds himself thinking about committing another crime just to go back somewhere that makes sense to him. But then he remembers what he promised Andy. So one day, Red makes a decision. He breaks parole and travels to the location Andy described to him years ago in the prison yard. After a long trip, he reaches a wide hayfield with a tall oak tree standing beside a stone wall, just the way Andy described it. He walks to it and finds a black volcanic rock that doesn't belong there. Underneath it is a small hidden box. Inside the box is money and a letter from Andy. In the letter, Andy tells Red that if he came this far, maybe he can come a little farther. He says he could use a good friend with him in Mexico, and he wants Red to come. Then Andy writes the words Red once argued with him about inside those prison walls. Hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things. Reading it changes something in Red that he didn't know could still be changed. For the first time, he chooses hope over the fear he's been carrying since the day he arrived at Shawshank. He crosses the border into Mexico, parole violation and all. As the bus carries him further from everything he's ever known, Red feels nervous and unsettled, but also something he hasn't felt in years. Alive. When he finally reaches the coast, the ocean is bright blue and the sky goes on forever. And standing near an old fishing boat on the beach is Andy Dufresne, looking up as his old friend walks toward him. After everything, the decades behind bars, the beatings, the corruption, the false conviction, Tommy's murder, the solitary confinement, the endless waiting, two men who met inside the worst place either of them had ever known are finally standing together as free men beside the ocean Andy spent 19 years dreaming about. And for the first time since those prison gates first opened to swallow them, both of them are free.